A history of the Wintanerta Methodist Church, established 1880. Wintanerta was a small farming community 5 miles east of Kadina on Yorke Peninsula, South Australia. The early settlers built the Wintanerta Methodist Church in 1880 in the middle of their community. The building was used for church services and Sunday school on Sundays, and day school during the week. Those close enough walked across paddocks to the church. Others travelled by horse-drawn vehicle, cart, dray, buggy or sulky. This account is based on the history of the church, compiled by Mrs. Hilda Cowley for the church centenary celebrations, held on September 28, 1980. Introduction. Farming begins near Kadina. In December 1873, an announcement of the first release of farmland near Kadina under the Deferred Payments Scheme was made in the South Australian Government Gazette. The land was surveyed into sections and purchased under a credit agreement for between £1 and £2 per acre. Farmers were required to live on their land and cultivate it, making specified improvements. In some circumstances, such as ill health, a credit agreement could be transferred. In the late 1800s, horse-drawn transport was slow, expensive, and limited in range. This resulted in towns and communities that were small and closely spaced. Cars first appeared in South Australia in 1899, but early models were rare, expensive, unreliable, and poorly suited to rough country roads. It was not until the 1920s that cars became affordable and dependable enough to begin replacing horses as everyday transport. The Wintanerta Church founders. This map shows the landholdings of the Wintanerta Church founders in 1880. One of the first tasks of the pioneers, besides clearing the land and building a dwelling for themselves, was to get together to build a chapel and meeting place for divine worship. In July 1880, a group of neighbouring farmers held a meeting to propose the building of the Wintanerta Church. They were Francis Gray, Richard William Nichols, Joseph John Tank, William Putland, Henry Johnson, John Bear, Thomas Roberts, Richard Williams, and Thomas Butson. It was proposed that the church be built on a central location on land offered by Mr. Butson. This location was about 7.5 kilometres northeast of the town of Kadina. The following account of the founding of the church was compiled by Mrs. Hilda Cowley in 1980.
In compiling the history of Wintanerta, a small community 5 miles east of Kadina, information has been taken from minute books, cash books, and from knowledge and recollections gained from descendants of the early settlers. One of the first tasks of the pioneers, besides clearing the land and building a dwelling for themselves, was to get together to build a chapel and meeting place for divine worship. The first minutes of meeting, July 1880, of the Wesleyan Church, Barunga Road, includes: resolved that in view of it being more central, we build the chapel on Mr. Butson's land, near his house, on a piece of land offered by him for that purpose. Resolved that dimensions of chapel be 25 feet by 16 feet within and 12 feet from floor to ceiling. Ceiling to be thin matchboard, floor 1-inch deal, roof, iron, ceiling and flooring joists, sawn timber, 2 windows on each side and 2 ventilators in ceiling. At the next meeting, held on the 9th of August, it was resolved that the following gentlemen be the trustees: Francis Gray, Richard William Nichols, Joseph John Tank, William Putland, George E. M. Putland, Henry Johnson, John Bear, Thomas Roberts, Richard Williams, and Thomas Butson. It was resolved that stone, pug, and water for building be brought on the ground by those present, and that R. W. Nichols act as overseer of works. Mr. Balmes offered to build the walls, flush up same and put on coping for the sum of £24 and 5 shillings be accepted. Mr. Davies be asked his lowest price for supplying material for carpenter work and fixing same, £41. The next meeting was held on the 6th of October, 1880. It was proposed that the church be opened for divine worship on Sunday, 24th of October, and that a tea and public meeting be held on the Wednesday following. Reverend J. Haslam to be invited to preach morning and evening, Reverend Rock in the afternoon. Church seats were brought from the Dora Church, which had closed. These and other furnishings were purchased from the Dora Church Trust for £34. Preaching services were to be held each Sabbath afternoon, one a fortnight on a weeknight, and a prayer meeting opposite week. Charge for sittings per quarter. Whole pew, 5 shillings. Single sittings, 1 shilling. A harmonium was borrowed and was later jointly purchased with the Sunday school. In 1885 it was decided to lengthen the church 10 feet in the clear. This was done by Martin and Ward for £42 16 shillings, with extras amounting to £10 10 shillings, and the church was reopened 2 months later. In 1886 the chapel was allowed for use by the government for a day school which continued until 1911. In 1892 it was decided to build a room at back of chapel for the use of the day school. Mr. T. E. Davies' tender of £52 5 shillings was accepted. In 1895 a petition was drawn up for signatures for a crossing and gates by the church. Turnstiles were erected but not a crossing. The Snowtown railway line was opened in 1879, about 18 months before the church was built. Mr. Henry Johnson, a loyal and devoted trustee from the beginning, died suddenly in 1904. Almost a quarter of a century had passed by this time. The horse-drawn vehicle was the mode by which everyone travelled, whether by cart, dray, buggy, or sulky. Those within a short distance walked across paddocks to Sunday and day school. Day school teachers had a sulky and pony and drove out from the town on Monday, staying with folk on farms during school days. Farmers provided hay and chaff for the ponies of teachers and ministers. Wages and salaries were not high, and goods were acceptable and augmented the wages. Farmers were not very financial either in those pioneering days. Cash books reveal how little money passed hands each year. Goods and services were much cheaper also. Printing of 100 hymn sheets in 1905 cost 8 shillings and 1 penny, and were often used for 2 anniversaries. A number of books for the library could be purchased for the price of 1 book at today's prices. Candles and kerosene were used for lighting for many years. 6 to 8 shillings was the price of a 4-gallon tin of kerosene. In 1908 the porch was added to the church. In 1911 pew rents were discontinued. All seats were free, but an annual subscription was expected for the upkeep of the church. In 1916, Mr. H. A. Kennett Sr., resignation accepted with regret and sorry to lose him from the church and work, retired to Kadina. In 1927, Miss Cowley resigned as organist and was thanked for her able services for 17 years. Mr. L. C. Bear appointed organist. In 1930, the church was renovated, floor repaired, etc. for cost of £22. In 1926, a tennis club was formed and courts laid down, and members played in the local country association until the Second World War. The Northern Yorke Peninsula Country Tennis Association, season 1933 to 1934 program is shown here. 4 clubs were in the association: Thomas Plains, Wintanerta, Bors Plains, and Thrington. As reported in the Kadina and Wallaroo Times, the Jubilee celebrations of the Wintanerta Methodist Church were held on Sunday and Monday, September 28th and 29th, 1930, and in every way proved to be a great success. The present Secretary of the Church Trust, Mr. W. G. Bear, assisted by members of the church, spared no effort to make it an outstanding event in the history of Wintanerta. And the way in which people all over the state responded to the invitations extended to them to be present at the services was very gratifying. The ministers of the circuit, Reverend W. J. Walker and Reverend F. W. Brasher, preached to the crowded congregations. The church choir rendered anthems and were assisted by solos from Mrs. J. Gilding of Auburn and Mrs. J. K. Nichols of Kadina. On Monday at 5 o'clock, a reunion high tea was enjoyed by about 300 people. A large marquee had been erected alongside the church specially for the occasion. At the public meeting which followed, Mr. J. T. Bear, who was present at the opening 50 years earlier, was chairman and delighted the audience with his stories of the old days. An outline of the early history of the church was prepared by Mr. Gray and was read by his daughter, Miss Gray. The church has continued its work unbroken since its inception, and its influence throughout the years and at the present time is ample evidence of the value of such churches to the community in which they stand and bear their witness to the highest things in life.
Philo visits Wintanerta and reminisces. Philo's letter, Kadina and Wallaroo Times, 23rd of November 1945.
On Sunday afternoon, I met Mr. Will White, and we drove along to the quiet little hamlet of Wintanerta, where I had again the privilege of meeting the folk who came along to the service. Here you meet the Bears, Cowleys, Mrs. Dix and daughters, and quite a goodly number of young people, and they give you a good service by their assistance. As I rode along the highway, I was impressed by the newly cut hay that lay in the paddocks waiting to be taken to stacking areas. Surely the change in the prospects is really inspiring and has done much to allay our fears of a few months ago. I looked out over the paddocks, and then I went back 45 years ago, and I pictured a group of us walking over Bear's land, Thames paddocks and Cocky Nobe's land, and ending up by coming in through the parklands back to the town. Among my cobbers were Billy Barron, Fred Kelly, Ern Huddy, Spence Nix, Bert James, Eli Smith, Tom Tilley, and many others. We did this generally on Saturdays when we had been afternoon shift, and we had plenty of fun, although we were often dog-tired. All these past experiences came rolling in as I was telling my driver about it. They were good days, and we enjoyed our work and our pleasure.
In 1947, the discontinuance of regular worship was recognized. The motorcar had made its impact on the community. The small communities, schools and churches found it difficult to carry on. It is with a sense of pride and gratitude that those who can remember wish to honor the memory of the pioneers of Wintanerta. Although visually we see nothing more than a crumbling building, the spirit of the pioneers will live on wherever descendants pass on from one generation to the next. The motorcar and mechanization on the farms has transformed the country and way of life. This and many small churches and communities are now only a memory. In the 1950s, it was realized that the church would not be opened again and would have to be disposed of. The land and building was sold to Mr. C. K. Kennett, and furniture and goods sold, and all proceeds were donated to the Kadina Church Trust, Manse Trust, and Sunday School, in accordance with and consent of conference.
Philo reminisces about the closure of the Wintanerta Church. Philo's letter, Kadina and Wallaroo Times, 29th of October 1953.
The news that the Wintanerta Church is about to end its days as an old landmark close to Kadina brings memories for so many of us who know the place. I was recalling my early days as a lad when I walked over those paddocks in search of hares and rabbits. Also, Bear's big scrub was generally a good spot to put up one or the other for the dogs to have a chase. I wouldn't mind having a shilling a mile for how many I walked in this spot. Later, the church came into its own for me as a place of worship, and I have sweet memories of the familiar pulpit and some of the services. I made many happy contacts with the Bears, Crosbys, Kennetts, Cowleys and Dixes and others, and I cherish these in my later years. I always thought the church had a real atmosphere of worship, and even its elevated position overlooking the rich wheat belts and grazing flocks seems to have added all this to such a place. I venture to say that many will remember the spot, even though the church may go as the place where they were christened or received as members into the church life. I look upon the spot where the old Army Hall used to stand, and remember it was the place 51 years ago where I began my Salvation Army activities. I pen this as a passing tribute to a lovely little church that for years was a city set on high, and I know scores of readers will regret that such a step is necessary, but time marches on despite everything to hold it up. Likewise, the Tikra folk will share the same feeling on the closing out there, but Alford will be the Mecca for the country Methodists. We say thank you for past loyal service for God and humanity.
The Wintanerta centenary celebrations were reported in the Yorke Peninsula Country Times on October the 8th, 1980. On the 28th of September 1980, a special morning service was held at the Wesley Uniting Church in Kadina to celebrate the centenary of the Wintanerta Church. This was followed in the afternoon by the unveiling of a cairn in front of the old church. There was an attendance of more than 100 at Wintanerta when the Reverend Patrick officiated at the unveiling of the cairn. Speakers included the Mayor of the District Council of Kadina, Mr. Dale Morfitt, who said that everything possible should be done to preserve landmarks of historical value. A past member of the church, Mr. Bernie Simmons, presented a detailed history of the church over the past 100 years. The cairn was unveiled by two cousins who had a close association with Wintanerta, Mrs. Mabel Correll, left, and Mrs. Hilda Cowley, right, both of Kadina. Mrs. Correll was in her 96th year, while Mrs. Cowley compiled the history of the church. The cairn bears the inscription to commemorate the centenary of the Wintanerta Methodist Church, built on this site in 1880, unveiled 28th September 1980. The Wintanerta Church and its commemorative cairn still stand 7.5 kilometres east of Kadina, beside Willamulka Road. Although the church building was long decommissioned, it was preserved and incorporated into a larger farmhouse, ensuring its survival. In September 2030, it will mark 150 years on this site, a quiet landmark that has served generations of the Wintanerta community